So I'd really like to talk about your chapter on the superego, destructive superego, and how, perhaps it's involved in warding off feelings of deep sadness and depression. You did a piece of work with a 65-year-old Mrs. A. I noticed that your description of the ego is this idea of a seat of integration between the self as experienced and the self as observed, which I've found a really useful way of thinking about the ego. But can you tell me a little bit about, the superego and how you've come to understand that in contrast perhaps to this sort of quality of the thinking mind?
Yes, well, actually, what you've said about the ego is important to keep in mind, because what I'm looking at particularly is a relationship between the ego or the self and a rather alien part of the mind, actually, not the same thing at all.
Yes.
And it's actually purporting to be the conscience.
Yes, so it's a slippery character.
It's a slippery character, and you see, originally, Freud himself understood the superego as something rather benign and helpful, a kind of conscience that one internalizes as a result of the experience of one's parents and others who are senior authorities and so on, internalizing social values, moral values and so on. But when he started working with depressed patients, he understood more clearly how the superego itself can become, as he described it, diseased.
Yeah.
Now that's on the continuum of what I have described as the destructive superego. And particularly, he understood it in depression. And that's what really psychoanalysts since Freud, in various schools of thought, have all agreed that in depression, it's the superego, it's the superego that's the source of trouble and the source that actually is linked to the severity of the depression.
Yes, and you cite Freud's beautiful paper, Mourning and Melancholia, in that chapter, and that really does tie in with Mrs. A and your experience with her.
Yes, it does. It does indeed. And so I'm looking, in the chapter, I'm looking at somebody who's actually suffered from a lifelong depression, really, bouts of depression. She was able to continue a successful career, but she was under psychiatric care much of her life, and she was when I saw her. And indeed, at the time I saw her, her psychiatrist was worried that she was about to become depressed again. So that was the starting point, really. She had a very unhappy life, really, altogether, and had various difficulties, but really right from the beginning, even with her immediate family, it was an unhappy time. And yet, I found myself feeling rather unsympathetic.
Yes, I noticed your real dislike of her.
Well, exactly. And it troubled me, really, because I couldn't put my finger on it. I couldn't actually, if you'd asked me, I would have found it very hard to explain. I might have found some way of explaining, but I wouldn't have been convinced. I just didn't know, but I just didn't like her. And if I could have referred her to somebody else, I have to say I would have, but I couldn't. I was the only person that she could have seen at that time.
I was particularly struck in this chapter of this sort of quality of envy, I think, in terms of the destructive superego and how it manifested in Mrs. A.
But you see, it didn't pan out that way. I didn't think about envy when I saw Mrs. A.
Okay.
I just knew I didn't like her. And but what I was aware of, and we did start, and when she came back, she was happy to see me and happy that I'd offered her therapy. But she said she was surprised because she thought that I was angry with her, and I didn't deny it. I didn't respond one way or the other, but I was, of course, rather uncomfortable. And we went on, but I became, and it was difficult, a difficult start, undoubtedly, but she did at one level gave me a very strong impression of the kind of, well, everything I did was wrong, actually. I mean, I was working and I thought I was being quite right. She said how silent I was being. She said I was keeping her waiting when, according to the clock on the wall and so on, I was on time. Various things. And, really, and what I understood then, I was really getting a taste of a really critical and severe superego, really. And when I was able to think with her and really, and I could actually came to see that she'd evoked in me my own critical superego. And when I could come to that thought, then I felt much more warmly towards her. And things shifted. And I was able to interpret in a way that she felt I understood her as time went on. And she was very touched. At one point I just said something like, well, I think you feel you've simply got to hold yourself together and you can't rely on anybody else. But she was deeply touched by that, actually, deeply touched. And then she turned to me and she said, well, why do I keep blaming myself so much? And then she told me how she relentlessly kept going through her previous work with a fine-tooth comb, criticizing every tiny mistake that she'd made, really. And she said, but my daughter says, Mum, these things don't matter. And I said, well, actually, I agree with your daughter. What you tell me, they don't.
So something about her self-editing.
Well, it was editing everything, not just herself, but invariably, of course, it edited the people in her life too. She was very, very lonely. And unfortunately, this kind of superego is, why do you need other people anyway? Or anybody who would want you, why would you want them? See, a really critical superego. What I sometimes call a no-win superego. You can't win with it, really, in one way or another. But it meant that she was intensely lonely.
But there's a real shift in the work, isn't there, from, this sort of destructive superego, as you describe it, to something that I believe, perhaps Caper talks about, a benign superego.
Not exactly. Caper talks about really that Caper has a take on this, and he's very much echoes, of course, Britton's thinking about the destructiveness of superego, and they both go back to Bion, and talking about he talked about the superego usurping the role of the ego. As Britton says, as an internal saboteur, masquerading as a conscience. But you see, Caper sees the therapeutic work as supporting the ego, but he sees it as primarily as bringing the superego into a more depressive, what the Kleinians would call a more depressive state, a more humane, you might say in your terms, more benign superego. So that's his take on it. I don't agree with that, and nor does Britton. Britton sees the point is, you see, because it's a superego masqueraded, it doesn't change. If you've got a very destructive superego, you can't get rid of it. But it's about strengthening the ego to make a judgment to actually see the ego the superego for what it is.
So the ego is sort of noticing the quality of this destructive superego and having a word with it.
It's taking its rightful role as proper judge, proper evaluator, really, in terms of being aware of both internal and external reality. The destructive superego is not interested in external reality.
Can you describe, what the turning point might have been in your work with Mrs. A?
I mean, I was full of admiration for her. She did a lot of work between the sessions. She was very thoughtful, and I did finally find a way of actually interpreting her energy, you see, and that made a difference. I mean, I'd made an interpretation about Marx, who said that any club that would have him as a member, he wouldn't want to join, you see, because it was in relation to what we were talking about. And she came back the following week, or following fortnight, I was seeing her fortnightly, she came back to say, well, actually, what you said about Groucho Marx, I can recognize, I can see it in me, and I don't like it. Now that was a turning point, because she was owning her envy and all the discomfort in that. You see, and that was really made a difference. And it meant that she could begin actually to value the work that she was so critically dismissing.
Yes.
And the pain of her retirement, the pain of losing the work. Because it was also defending, protecting herself from the loss. Because it was so denigrated. Why would she miss her work? She made so many mistakes. It was so horrible. So that's where envy is very important, and it's what Britton talks about. He relates it very much to an envious superego and depression.
Yes.
Not something that Freud had, although Klein herself had recognized envious superego. But you see, you touched on it earlier on when you talked about the envy. Now you see, I was in touch with the severity of Mrs. A's superego. I was in touch with that because it matched and it evoked something in myself which found a similar resonance. I wasn't suffering from Mrs. A's superego. It doesn't work that way. People sometimes mistakenly refer to projected identification as, oh yes, it's the patient or the client putting their feelings into you. Yeah, that's the unconscious fantasy. Unconscious fantasy is that I can get rid of things that I find uncomfortable, and they're yours, they're not mine anymore.
It also reminds me of Bolas's work on the receptive unconscious, that these projections find a hook in us as practitioners and something rises to the surface.
Yes, it was only much later, after the work had been done and when I was revisiting the paper again and writing more about it and so on, that I remembered, as you pointed out, that at the very beginning, in the very first assessment session, Mrs. A had said to me, what's the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist? Well, I mean, I'd forgotten she said that to me, actually. Well, the difference is that the psychiatrist is on, they're at the top of the pyramid or whatever, in all sorts of ways, including pay scale. I usually had good relationships with psychiatrists, certainly with Mrs. A's, so that wasn't the issue. But of course, it certainly sparked some envy in me, really, envy that I felt towards these very, what I regard as highly paid. So you see, that's how I got in touch with what she projected right from the beginning. When she said, oh, you were angry with me, what did she mean? I didn't think about that conversation, really. And so it was only much later that I realized that what had happened was she'd evoked my own envy, which was very uncomfortable to me because my own superego was pretty disapproving of such things. And I completely repressed it. I couldn't even remember it. But it coloured, it was actually repressed by a hostile superego that condemned my envy in that kind of way.
It takes some real courage, I think, to acknowledge our envious feelings. I mean, I've been grappling with the way in which sort of envy within the destructive superego is made use of in a sort of rampant, deregulated neoliberalism. That there's something about that for me that is being made use of. If I think about the human subject as sort of constructed in some way, or, being predicated on a lack. If I think of Adam Phillips' work on sort of capitalism generating an appetite for appetite, there's something about envy, the destructive superego, and how, the discourse of neoliberalism, the individual that supersede all others hooks into that part of us somehow. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I mean, I think that's a very interesting exploration of it, really, in terms of society and psychosocial thinking in that kind of way. It was very interesting because there was a talk in the Legal Mind series, and it was called Marching with the Superego, actually. But it was about deregulation in our society and the problems of, widespread deregulation, and you see it so rampant, really, in all sorts of ways that have been so destructive. And you see, unfortunately, psychoanalysis has also followed that, because despite Freud's and Beyond's earlier understanding about the structure of the superego, it's been ignored until very recently.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's been really illuminating, Paul, you know, to think about how the destructive superego, projective identification might sort of, you know, emerge in the therapeutic dyad. And, you know, we've been grappling with this idea of how we can make use of these sort of ideas also to a wider social context. And, you know, there's something about the book, I think, which makes these links, sometimes explicitly, sometimes more implicitly, but it's certainly a really thought-provoking chapter, I think.